The air inside the barn was thick, with dust and the heavy scent of hay that had long since rotted into a damp, pungent odor. Rays of sunlight pierced through the gaps in the weathered boards, thin slits of gold cutting through the gloom. Shackled to one of the beams was a young woman whose arms trembled from exhaustion, her dress dirtied and torn, her spirit crushed by days of loneliness and fear. She had been left there abandoned, a forgotten soul with no voice to call for help. Her only company, the echoes of creaking wood and the distant cries of the wind outside. Her thoughts raced between hopelessness and despair, each hour blending into the next until time itself lost meaning. Her lips cracked from thirst, her wrists raw from the iron cuffs that bound her, and yet she clung to the faintest thread of survival, because something within her refused to die completely. Outside, the world went on as though her suffering did not matter. But fate had a way of weaving unlikely rescues at the most desperate times. Just as the sun began its descent and painted the horizon with hues of fire, the sound of boots crunching against gravel reached her ears. Her heart leapt with a mixture of fear and hope, unsure if the one approaching meant further torment or salvation. The barn door groaned open, flooding the shadows with a blaze of orange light, and in stepped a tall man wearing a weathered hat and a vest that bore the marks of labor and dust from the trails. His eyes scanned the dim interior until they fell upon her fragile form. For a moment he froze as though struck by the cruelty of the sight before him, but then his steps grew purposeful, echoing against the wooden floor as he approached. She flinched, instinctively pulling against her restraints, but he raised a hand in calm reassurance. His voice, low and steady, carried the weight of honesty when he said, "You don't have to be afraid anymore." Kneeling, he inspected the chains that dug into her wrists and frowned at the cruelty of the iron. With strong, calloused hands he pulled a tool from his belt and worked at the shackle until it snapped free with a loud clang that reverberated through the barn. The sudden release sent her collapsing forward, but he caught her in his arms with a gentleness that contrasted his rugged appearance. Her tears fell against his shirt as sobs racked her body, the relief overwhelming after so much despair. "You're safe now," he whispered, his tone both fierce with promise and tender with compassion. Lifting her effortlessly, he carried her toward the barn door, each step deliberate, as though he bore not just her weight but the heavy burden of her suffering. Outside, the setting sun cast its glow upon them, a baptism of light after the suffocating darkness she had endured. She buried her face against his chest, inhaling the scent of leather, sweat, and the open plains, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she dared to believe in freedom. What she did not know was that this moment would not simply end her captivity, but begin a story that would change both of their lives forever. The night air was cool against her face as he carried her away from the barn, his arms steady as though he had been waiting all his life to bear this particular burden. The stars slowly emerged above them. Countless pinpricks of light spread across the heavens like watchful guardians. Each step took her farther from the shadows of her suffering and closer to the unknown promise of safety. Her body trembled with weakness, yet in his hold she felt a strength that no chain could break. She wanted to speak, to ask who he was, to understand why he had come, but exhaustion silenced her, and so she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. He mounted his horse with her cradled in his arms, settling her gently before securing his hat and guiding the animal forward with practiced ease. The horse's hooves struck the earth in a steady rhythm, carrying them across fields bathed in silver light. Silence wrapped around them, not heavy like in the barn, but peaceful, the kind of silence that promised healing. After a long while, his voice broke the stillness. "You don't ever have to go back to that life," he said firmly, his words carrying the conviction of a man who had seen too much wrong in the world to let it stand unchallenged. She lifted her weary gaze to meet his, and in his eyes she saw no judgment, only the steady glow of a protector who believed in her worth even when she could not. Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time they were not born of despair. They were tears of release, of gratitude, of a heart daring to feel hope. As they approached his ranch, lantern light flickered in the windows, warm and welcoming, as though the home itself was alive and waiting for her. He dismounted and carried her inside, where the scent of bread and wood smoke filled the air, where comfort replaced cold, and where silence was softened by the crackling of a fire. He set her down gently upon a chair, covering her shoulders with a blanket, and crouched so his eyes met hers. "You are safe now," he repeated, his voice unwavering, and this time she believed it. The weight of her past still clung to her, scars of memory etched deep, but in his presence she felt the possibility of a tomorrow that was not bound by chains. She realized then that survival was no longer a solitary battle. She had been found, rescued, and claimed not as a burden, but as someone worthy of care. The barn where she had once been shackled would fade into nothing more than a nightmare from which she had awoken, while this moment, this man, would become the anchor pulling her into the light. For those listening, let this story remind you that no matter how dark the shadows may seem, there is always the chance that someone will walk into your life, break your chains, and carry you into freedom.